All right, Nightmare Success and Out listeners, we are back, and I've got a treat for you guys. So I've got to get a shout out to Marvin Cotton Jr. For those who listen to this program, he's has an incredible story. Wrongly accused of murder, finally gets out after 20 years, doing incredible things. He's a fancy author now, marching all over the place with Better Not Broken. So anyway, Marvin and I talk frequently, and he says, "Oh, Brent," he said, "You have got to talk. You have got to talk to Tony Gant." He said he's doing big things in Michigan. He's working and advocating for formerly incarcerated. And I said, "Oh my gosh, yeah, anybody that Marvin gives me, I'm like, yes, let's go." So give you a little background on Tony here. Tony was incarcerated the Michigan Department of Corrections for 20 years, from 95 to 2015. He's organized successful campaigns around housing and employment for directly impacted people. Tony is 2021 leading with Conviction Fellow with Justice Leadership USA. He's a father. He's an author. Midnight Whispers. Go check that out. He's also an owner of a lawn care service, Gant Lawn Care, at Gant Lawn Care. So Tony is also the director of policy and programs operations at Nation Outside, a nonprofit organization that advocates for the rights of formerly incarcerated persons. Can't wait to jump into all this. Tony and I were talking just a little bit before this. Before we get started, I want to introduce our sponsor, Auto Plaza Direct. You know, who likes spending a couple of weekends walking lots looking for a car? Then you spend like 4 or 5 hours in the dealership to buy a car. I don't think anybody really likes that. It's like a trip to the dentist. Well, there's a better way to take all that away from you, all that pain and hassle of getting a car. Auto Plaza Direct, they're your personal car concierge. Just let them know the car you want, what you can pay, and they'll go find that car for you. They'll negotiate your best price and deliver that car to you in any state. They also offer you warranties and financing. Full service. Go to autoplazadirect.com to get started with your personal car concierge. The new hassle-free way, the car buying experience you deserve. Auto Plaza Direct. Tell them Brent from Nightmare Success sent you. Okay, folks, let's get into this. Tony Gant, welcome in.
Thank you so much, and good morning to everybody. And I appreciate your time, Brent. I'm excited. Right? Let's have a great conversation. Let's educate some people.
I am too. I don't know what they're doing in Michigan, but everybody that I have talked to, from Marvin to Daryl, now you guys, you don't let any grass grow under your feet. You take the hits and get back up and keep making changes. And you really, like you and I were talking about, Tony, one of the things that I want to get into today, we'll get into it, but we were talking about all the great things that you're doing now, but you said, hey, Brent, it wasn't easy, and getting in wasn't easy, and getting out wasn't easy. Let's go back a little ways. Let's get people introduced, Tony, into, because you basically said you kind of grew up in prison. So before prison, Tony Gant, growing up as a kid, what was that like?
I grew up in a small town called Albion, Michigan, and my grandmother raised me. So that was my father's mother. So I had, while we grew up poor, there was a lot of love. I had a lot of love. My grandmother was my angel. And so I grew up in some housing complexes in the 70s. And it was fun, right? We were all young and primarily Black, but, we had a lot of fun. We went out to play every day, and that was my grandmother's mantra often: go outside and play, get out of the house.
And play.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I transitioned some time with my father, and he lived in Chicago, and my mother, who lived in Jackson. But primarily I was with my grandmother in Albion.
So your grandmother was just a big player in your life. And
Absolutely.
Siblings wise, Tony, brothers, sisters?
Absolutely. On the other side, there are 7 of us in total.
Wow.
I'm the oldest. Yep, 7 of us in total. I have a sister that's older than me, and then there's me, and everybody else is under me. Yep. So there are 3 boys and 4 girls. Yep. So got a huge family. Yep.
That's a
Huge
good sized family. So as you got into the world of being a kid, going to school, what was your school life? How did that all interplay with you?
Yeah, school was fine. I wouldn't say school was a huge problem. I I I ultimately graduated in 1991, but I couldn't walk because I was in the county jail at that time for a drug charge and a gun charge. So I didn't actually walk the stage, but I did actually graduate in 91. I think beginning of high school was pretty typical. Um, I, I started, really focus on my academics, a lot of college bound classes, but that waned as I got an opportunity to learn what it was like to sell drugs. Right, that was a feeling of having some power and some notoriety that I was kind of invisible before then. So,
Tony, let's talk about that a little bit, because as you know, you're talking about grandma saying, "Hey, go out, play." When you went out to play, did it become just really natural for you to fall into that world of the neighborhood people that did you fall into people that were doing that and it became very easy for you to get involved in that, or how did that come to you?
Well, I'll say we kind of all grew up together. Albion is a small town, right? It's
Yeah.
pretty close knit. And as some of my early childhood friends began to, I remember a friend, and I was still very dedicated to school at this point, dropped out of high school. And I was like, talking to him. We grew up together. And I'm like, bro, what is you doing?
What are you
And
doing? Yeah.
yeah, what are you dropping out of school? And he told me bluntly, like, I already know how to count. I don't need school anymore. I can count.
Uh-huh.
And he was doing really well selling drugs.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
Well, and I would think that that's a big deal too. If somebody starts selling drugs and they're making money when around the group doesn't really have that much money, absolutely that stands out. I mean,
Absolutely.
how do you miss that? Yeah.
Yep.
So as time goes, you've had a little bit of experience with the law. If I remember, you're after high school, with that transition between that time period that you get the sentence to that, what's going on in your world?
So funny story, right? So as I mentioned, I graduated in 91. I was accepted to Western, but I never went. I ended up enrolling in another college in outside of Chicago called DeVry Institute, right?
Okay.
So I'm really selling drugs, but the expectation for my grandmother was that I would go to college. I would be first generation, right? So
Right.
I'm trying to meet that expectation while also pursuing this idea on my mind that I'm going to be this huge drug dealer. So I probably attended maybe 2 classes in total at DeVry. I had a room and everything and talked to sorority people, but that life was not interesting at all. I was constantly on the freeway back to Michigan.
Yeah. So lead us into the world of when your nightmare fell on you. Like, you're in the world of dealing drugs. Do you know that you're in a situation where, or do you think you're being investigated? How does this happen, and how does this go down for you, Tony?
Good. So as I continue kind of down that path, obviously I just stopped going to school in total. There was no need to keep driving back over to go to class. And I just got more and more enmeshed in that life. And drug dealing is not what we see on the movies. It has its ups and downs, and there were some ups, and finally I went back. I caught another drug case on the freeway. I ended up getting sent to boot camp in
Okay.
Michigan. So I go through the boot camp and get out on tether. Pretty much convinced that it was pretty short stay. It was pretty easy to get through boot camp and do the tether. But
If I understand Tony, if I understand the boot camp, because there's a couple of people been on that have been through the boot camp thing, they're more or less saying this is going to be hardcore military style, and you get 2 or 3 strikes and you're out and you got to serve the full sentence. But if you don't and you stay with it, then it's like a few months or a year or whatever, and then you've got probation or whatever. Is that kind of what that was?
Absolutely. It was basically a 90-day program.
Got it.
To get away from a 2-year sentence.
Got it.
So I did the 90 days.
As long as you do your 90
Yep.
days, you're compliant.
Yep.
You don't get the 2 years.
Yep, absolutely. And so you're released after those, I think it was 91 days, on house on a tether, and with a parole officer. And so I went through that process. And I find, supervision is an interesting thing, right? Then at that point, I was required to pay a lot of money every week for the tether. My parole officer knew I didn't have any employment, but I was still able to pay this money every week. And there was just like a tacit agreement, like, okay, just make sure you pay your money, and without any questions, right? And so, my parole officer would comment often that you dress better than me, blah, blah, blah. But it was just like, okay, just don't get any trouble.
Any further than that, right?
Right. That was it. And so I got off of that tether, and, life went on. The case that led me to the 20-year sentence was just in that life. It was just in that life that a disagreement continued to spiral to other things, and it led to a violent moment one night. And yeah, I left and went on a run to Atlanta. So I spent a couple months in Atlanta on a run, which was kind of fun, actually. Came back to Michigan, and absolutely, as soon as I was back in Michigan, I was arrested.
That was it.
Yeah,
Did you know that, Tony? Because I've talked to a couple of people, Seth Ferrante and a couple other people. He was actually most wanted, and so was Danny Cox. They said they got tired of living, or they got really loose with living on the run. Why did you go back?
So I came back up to do something with a friend.
Okay.
He was telling me about this opportunity, so I was gonna come back up, and we were gonna take advantage of this opportunity, and I was gonna go back to Atlanta. While I was up here back in Michigan, really unwise. That was really unwise on my part. I was absolutely arrested. I think it was maybe the 3rd day I was back.
So what happened? Did they just surround your car, or did they?
No. They came to the house I was at. I was at my sister's house. I'm not sure how word got out, but word absolutely got out that I was back, and police absolutely, they were serious, and they came, and that was my last day of freedom until 2015.
Wow. So going into this world, this has got to feel different to you, Tony. I mean, or did it feel different to you? Did you know that this was going to be this isn't a 90-day boot camp thing? This feels different. They're acting different. I'm looking at more time. Was that going through your mind?
I think I knew it was a severe charge. I think I was just too young to understand what 20 years is. I hadn't really been I hadn't been on my own long enough to understand what 20 years was. I had been on my own maybe a couple years, right? Living independently. So I had no idea what 20 years was really like. As far as the severity of the charge, absolutely. They were trying to give me more time. and they were absolutely not interested in any plea deals. So it was absolutely a very serious situation.
Was it an assault charge or what you said it was a violent charge? What did they actually
Oh,
try
no,
to charge you with?
absolutely. They charged me with assault with intent to commit murder.
Okay.
So yeah, I
So they
shot
were
up.
serious. Yeah, they were really trying to get you down to serving big time.
Yeah, it was a
I
serious.
can't
It was,
imagine. And you know, you and I talked a little bit about this, Tony, before we got on, because you know I think everybody, when you get sentenced, like to me, getting a 5-year sentence, I couldn't imagine going any more time than I did. You getting in from 95 to 2015, I just stop and think about what in the world changed from 95 to 2015. Almost like the whole world changed. You know, there really wasn't internet. There really wasn't much cell phones. I mean, what changed from 95 to 2015 in the world of technology and how we live? I can't even imagine. So you going in at whatever that your young age of 20 something, basically growing up in there, walking into that world, Tony, and understanding that this was going to be your life for a while. Did you walk in thinking anything? What was your first day like going in there?
in Michigan, when you're young, your first, let's see, did I go to Riverside for quarantine? I may have went to Riverside for quarantine, and then I went to MR, which was the Michigan Reformatory. It was a prison for young people that were either serving long periods of time or who had gotten a lot of trouble in other facilities. So they were all sent there. So prison as a young person at MR was interesting because you had a lot of young folks, early teens, early 20s, with basketball score sentences or life without the possibility of parole. Mm-hmm. And so that was a different environment, right? One I had to get used to quickly.
Yeah.
And so that's I'll say one of the things that I think maybe a couple years in, people used to come in from the yard, and I wouldn't, there was a saying back then, and I want to say it was like all day, because everybody was serving so much time.
Yeah.
And people, the young men there with me met that time with this sense of bravado, because I think it was just too much to wrap their head around, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
So because you talked about as going in there that at some point, because I'm sure your mind was trying to wrap around, okay, I'm in here. You've basically been alive for 20 years. Now they're going to give you 20 years, but you became a reader at some point.
Right. I fell
How far into your prison world did that start for you?
I would say pretty early on, right? Yeah. That, as I mentioned, I would say one of the last things, because I bought a typewriter and all that other stuff, there are, when you go to prison, all these things back then that you wanted to have, and TV was last on my list. And so because TV was last on my list, I was more concerned with my case. And that was one of the ways I wrapped my mind around that 20-year sentence, was that there was an opportunity to get this reversal and go back to court and get the sentence reduced. Just all those things helped in those years.
Probably eat up your time focusing on that, right?
Focusing on that appeal, really trying to learn the law.
Yeah.
And so that benefited in a lot of other ways, though, later on in life. Yeah.
Did you have any mentors in there, Tony? Did you, like, people that you sought out, like how they were doing their time, or did you just decide this is how I'm doing my time and this became Tony's time?
Absolutely. You grow up with people in there. You build really strong relationships and bonds. You become like family. And for a lot of us that were at MR in those early 90s, we're still close today, right? we learned the law together, talked about our cases together and what was going on in family. And that's how that was absolutely a family and still a family. Yeah. And as far as mentors, I think from my experience, and I'm not saying this is probably pretty unique, I did have a number of people that saw a lot of potential in me, and they poured into me in a lot of different ways.
What about your prison work? You have prison job that I'm sure you probably had a lot of different prison jobs.
So yeah, one of my first, again, so I'm coming in with a high school diploma with some college experience. So my first job, I believe, in prison was as a tutor. So I'm trying to teach people the skills they need to get a GED. From there, I became a clerk, and then after becoming a clerk, I basically spent the rest of my time doing law work.
Yeah.
For other people. Yeah.
Which would have been a very sought after thing in prison, somebody that knows the law a little bit and that can help them with some, or, file a motion or any of those things. That's like gold in prison. Which also earns you respect too, Tony. That, one of the things that, it's a primitive environment in prison, but there is that level of respect. And if you're one of those you're a person that walks with that type of respect, prison is not as bad as those people that don't have that respect. Because if you don't have that respect in prison, you can, I think, live some dark hours.
Definitely. In prison, let me not, I don't want to talk about prisons through any type of rose-colored glasses. My first years in MR, I saw some pretty horrific stabbings. Never saw stabbings before, but saw some pretty horrific stabbings, some pretty brutal stuff. And you learn just how violent prison can be from living there.
Yeah, I mean, it's the talking about stabbings. I mean, you live in that world, so you have to figure out how do I live in this world when this is actually what's going on in this world. And it sounds like to me that you kind of carved out an area for yourself, Tony, of things that you knew and you could help with, whether it be tutoring or helping people file things. When was it that you found out that you weren't going to get out with your motions? How far along did you go with that?
Wow, that's a great question, Britt. I think I fought. Let's see. I think ADPA came out in, what year was that? 96. And that put a limit on the amount of time you had to file your habeas petition from your state court conviction. And I want to say it was 96. It may have been 98. It was somewhere in there. And so when I left MR, I went to Jackson, and Jackson is notorious in Michigan as a prison system. So I left MR, a notorious prison for young people, and went to this prison that was notorious for adult people. And I ended up getting another job is what they call a legal writer. So I worked in the law library in Jackson. And again, I'm still helping people with their cases, still trying to work on mine. Eventually, I filed my habeas petition. I think I made the deadline, but obviously I was denied by the district court. And when I went to the Sixth Circuit on my notice of appeal, they denied it. Filed my certiorari, they denied it. And that was pretty much the end of the road because I already filed a collateral petition in state court. There were no other options for me. And so I kind of accepted that, and this would have been, let me see, probably 2001, 2002. It was like, this is pretty much it.
So how did that affect your time and mindset? Because I mean, I can't, I would assume, Tony, that time that you had from 95 to 2001, is you're all geared. And that's, you go to bed thinking, okay, I got this, or wake up thinking I'm going to work on this. That's over. did you have a hard time with that adjustment of, okay, now I'm just doing time? Well, how did you readjust that? Because I'm a big believer that you can't do time looking at 10 or 15 years, or for me, it was, 2 or 3 years. You have to do it one day at a time, try to get through that, find something good, move to the next day. And then now you've got a new season. Now it's spring. Now it's summer. It's really weird how you count time in prison, because you're like, oh, I only got one more winter or whatever you do. But
Absolutely.
for you, Tony, that had to be because you're still looking at a lot of time.
I
Did you
was.
did you readjust yourself strategy wise, mindset wise? Did you go down? Did you get depressed? I mean, I can't imagine really kind of what that turn was for you there.
So I at that point I really embraced doing the bit, right? And I know that may be a terminology that people aren't really familiar with, but I really transitioned into just what life is in prison.
Yeah.
And when I talk to young people in like jails and talk to them about, they're facing serious time, I talk to them about things that you just kind of fall into as you're doing your time, whether or not you're as I was doing, law work and exercising and my sports.
Yeah.
And there's a sport basically for every season.
Yeah.
And you get really like just into that bit, into those habitual days and habitual seasons. And that's kind of how my bit went.
Yeah, and it's funny because I was just rewatching Shawshank Redemption, which I also saw that when I was in prison, which was weird. But Morgan Freeman, there's so many different lines in that movie, but one that really sticks out to me is that he's talking to Andy when he first gets there, and he says, you look at these walls, you look around, and when you first get here, you look at them as if they're to keep you in. And he said, the longer you're here, they're like the arms that give you comfort to stay in. And it's, I see what you're saying, Tony, about that, falling into your bit, because you can really fall into all the sports things, all the workout things, all the different things that happen, because it happens on schedule. Everybody walks at the same time. Everybody eats at the same spot. Everybody you shower at the same, you get into these weird routines. And I think some of the routines are for you believing personally that you're in control of something when you're really not, but you are. It's your schedule. The only thing that knocks the hell out of that schedule is when they lock you down and ruins the whole day, and you
right.
realize you can't watch the World Series on TV or whatever it is. You realize that schedule that you think you own, all of a sudden, the siren goes off, a lockdown, and there you are. But let's talk about you getting close to the door to your freedom. Because I think I forgot to ask you, Tony, with the family that you had, it was such a large family, did you stay connected into that world, or were you into only the prison world and became unconnected from the outside?
Yeah, so I had during my incarceration some pretty good family support.
Okay.
I had a sister that she's a twin, and she was, pretty much there as much as she could be there. My grandmother, obviously, until she passed away, was there as much as she could be. And I had an aunt and some cousins. So I had a pretty good family support. I will
That's
say.
good, because a lot of people don't.
Absolutely. Yep. During much of that incarceration period, I had some pretty good family support.
I think, Tony, what I always thought is I was very lucky on visits and that, and I always felt like that visit almost was like you kind of almost straddled the fence to be able to touch the outside, because you were hearing things, and it was just it felt different than being inside prison. And then when that visit was over, you got sucked back into the prison world. But I do think there's something about that, to have that visit and that connection, that you feel like when you make that adjustment to the outside, you've had some contact so that you're not totally encapsulated into the world of prison.
Yeah, I never really thought deeply about while I think it's great and I think it's important that people keep connections with their family for the purposes of ultimately becoming a better person. As far as the visits, I don't know. They were always such weird things, and the more you get of them, and then just the return to prison was always like you
Tough.
go back to the unit, back to the block, and it's like I'm back. I mean, yeah,
real downer.
yeah,
Real downer.
absolutely.
And some people decided they didn't want that. You know that I know 2 or 3 guys that said it was just too tough and wanted just not to be. You just wanted to do their time and be done, and they'd figure it out later because they didn't. It was too tough for them to see the people that they loved, and
You have to absolutely.
there's a lot. There's a lot that goes on there. I mean, there's a lot that happens in that world.
Absolutely. I remember a visit towards the end of my time, and my grandmother passed away a year before I was released, right?
Mm.
And so towards the
that
end,
had to be so tough, Tony. Somebody
that was
dying while you're in prison, and
yeah,
somebody
well,
like that.
because that was my mother, right? So that's
Yeah.
what made it so rough. People passed away during that 20 years, obviously, but nobody that close.
Yeah.
And so towards the end, she would my grandmother never learned to drive, right? So she dropped out in like middle school, but she was like this amazing woman. So she never learned to drive, and she would always either my aunt would bring her or she would catch a ride with a friend. And so towards the end, she had a cane, and it was really hard for her to move around. But one day she decides that she's going to ride up to see me. I was in level 1 in Jackson, and she comes, and I don't even know she's coming. I wish I could have told her not to come, but she came, and she's by herself. And she has all these, you had to get these prison tokens so you can get to the vending machine. And she was determined that she was going to give me all this stuff out of the vending machine. And she was just struggling at the vending machine. And then in the visiting room as a prisoner, you can't get up, right? You're not supposed to get up and go towards no vending machine, do none of this stuff, because they're sure you're smuggling drugs every time you move.
Right.
So she's over there smuggling, and I'm talking to the officer in the visiting room, like, listen, she's not gonna be able to do this without any help. And it was really like, on the one hand, that was her way of saying she loved me, right? What she was trying to do, but on the other hand, it was just so stressful. Just dealing with that.
Well, I mean, it's really sweet that she came there to see you. I mean, I and didn't drive, so I mean, that was just
absolutely.
Yeah. Well, let's go in. I want to get into you getting close to getting out and then getting out. So before we do that, let's take a break here. Recognize our other sponsor here, that is AaronDuncan.net. It's a full-service global communications agency. They believe communication's everything. At AaronDuncan.net, their job is to make bad news go away. They're known as the trauma surgeons of brand crises, corporate scandals, high-profile litigation, legal investigations, prosecutions. To be in the public eye in the 21st century is to experience a crisis. It's no longer a question of whether a crisis will strike. It's a question of whether you will be prepared when it does. Aaron's services include crisis management, crisis communication, media relations, reputation management, positive public relations, prison consulting, and coaching. For a confidential consultation regarding crisis or reputation management, advisory role, speaking engagement, please contact Aaron at AaronWDuncan@gmail.com. Text or phone 636-236-5071. I could have used AaronDuncan.net when I was going through my stuff.
Absolutely.
A crisis is here. Please come help.
Absolutely.
Please, waving my flag. Okay, so Tony, you're getting close to the door, and you've been in for a while, longer than most that go into prison and come out. What's going through your mind? How are you thinking? How am I getting out of here?
I was again at a level one. So I had been to a level one, before, and I had blew it, which means I got in trouble and ended up.
You might explain what a level one is, just for the people listening out there.
Yep. So in Michigan, prisons are classified by levels. So it goes 1 to 5. And I think maybe we have one supermax prison in Michigan, only one. So generally it's 1 to 5. And so one is generally the lowest level, lowest custody level. Is about security and what. So one is the lowest custody level in Michigan. And so the closer you are either to your out date or depending on your disciplinary record, that decides where you'll be placed in prison. And so I had been in a level one before, but again, like I said, I was in my bit. And in your bit means a lot of different things. So I end up blowing level one at that point and going all the way up to ad seg and then having to work my way back down. So I'm back at a level one. I'm in college. So I'm taking college classes there. I really didn't anticipate that I was getting a parole this my first time. I really didn't expect it. I remember talking to my counselor, my unit counselor, and he was going over my tickets, my disciplinary record, and saying, "Yeah, this is pretty bad. I'm not sure. I don't think you're going to get a parole." And I didn't think that as well. So I was still like mentally, I was just still in my bed. I was still, working out. I had a store, going to school. Yep, I was still doing my bit.
Yeah. So were you thinking when you get that parole, is it all of a sudden, wow, what am I going to do? Or had you been thinking about planning on what's going to happen when I get out?
Absolutely. So I already started planning what I wanted to do once I was released.
Okay.
I was married. I got married maybe a year before.
Okay.
So I was married at that point, and I was already planning all the things I wanted to do once I was released. I just didn't think this first parole was going to happen. So I built into my mind a cushion for a Passover or a flop, which is them telling me they'll see me in another year.
Okay. I got to ask you though, Tony, you got married while you were in prison. So did you actually have a ceremony in prison?
Absolutely. We had a real ceremony. Not not a traditional ceremony like in a church, but absolutely a priest and a best man and all that good stuff.
And the person that you married, had she been with you through the journey of what you were going through?
No, she had not been with me for the entire bit. She was a friend that would pop in and out of my life during incarceration. It was a person that I knew, like I said, before I was incarcerated. She and I had the connection that we both were at one point involved in a lot of stuff in the streets.
Yeah.
And so that was our connection. She had already changed her life around. And so, yeah.
Well, the only reason I bring that up, I think that's huge, that you got married, she turned her life around. And to me, if I'm you thinking, coming out of this world that I've been in of 20 years, and I've got somebody that I can, trust and that is already gone through the life transformation, basically transition, to help you kind of transition out, it had to be kind of a big deal for you, right?
Absolutely. And I think in a lot of ways, a lot of that stability was really helpful in those initial months when everything was kind of falling apart after my.
Yeah, let's talk about that, Tony, because I don't want to skirt over the fact that when people get out and people start doing good things, that doesn't just happen. there's a lot of things that you have to swim through and eat a lot of shit sandwiches to get to the good stuff of feeling like this is me, this is what I want to be doing. What was it like for you getting out and plugging yourself back into a society after 20 years?
It's a couple different things. I think first, I often tell people I was extremely naive as to what life was going to be like post-release. I had a lot of ideas on what I was going to do. I've done most of those things actually.
Which is cool.
But,
I want to talk about those too. Yeah.
but what I'll say is that my naivety was based on the fact that it would be easier post-release than it really was. Just the ability to get a job was it was just utterly impossible. I'll just say that. It was impossible for me to get employment when I was released. And I tried every way I could to get a job.
What they mostly say to you, Tony, just so people know on the other side, when you go out there, you're trying to go get a job, they tell you got to go get a job, got to have a job, and then what happens?
You apply everywhere, right? You do your applications, you get your resume done, and you start applying for jobs. When I left the streets, there was no internet, so I had to figure out, like, you can apply online. My parole officer would be telling me, and get on the web, and I had no idea what my parole officer was talking about, but he talked to me as though I should know all these things. And so there was obviously this huge learning curve of how to apply online versus applying in person. When I would go to the staffing agencies where I thought I would have the biggest opportunities, the fact that I was still on parole and I had a violent conviction was a huge barrier, and nobody really wanted to take that risk. At least they looked at it as a risk. When I got really close, there was one moment I was applying for I want to say it wasn't UPS, but it was another company that did stuff.
UPS
similar.
is a company that hires ex-felons.
Yeah. And so I was applying at their airport division, and it was great. I had a great interview, and so I had to be there super early because the shift started around 5 something, and so my wife at the time and my stepson were sleeping in the car as I went into this interview. And this is, I don't know, maybe 8th, 9th, 10th interview with no results, but they're still like, okay, I'll take you, I'll get you there. And so I'm in this interview. I interview with a lady, and we're talking about each other, and it turns out she's a classically trained paralegal. And so we hit it off, right? We hit it off. She's like, oh my God, I got to get you. You would be perfect, blah, blah, blah. And we just got to do this criminal background check, blah, blah, blah. And it's an amazing interview. Obviously, after that criminal background check, that didn't pan out at all. Yeah.
Which is such a shame, because a paralegal who had been more or less trained in the prison system would be a wonderful person to have as a paralegal in a law firm. And that's what one of the things I see, Tony, and we've got people that I've had on the show where they have had a seat at the table, but when you talk about parole and you talk about paralegals, you talk about somebody that's clerking for a judge, it means something if there is somebody there that has a seat at the table that has actually experienced a lot of the things that they're reviewing. And
absolutely, that
needs to happen more than it doesn't. And it's just such a hard door to enter.
It is. And not to get off track, but yeah, something just recently in Michigan where a Supreme Court justice hired a formerly incarcerated person who's doing amazing work, who has a Juris Doctorate to clerk for her. like just this huge blowback, right? Um, and
Well,
luckily, I think
one of the judges said something really bad, and I read that story, Tony, because when I was reading about you, that came up in the story, because one of the things you do is advocate for people who've been previously incarcerated. But he had all the qualifications of everything that you would ever want for somebody that would be in that role as a clerk, except for the fact that he had a record.
right, and I I, I think while it was unfortunate for Pete and for Justice Bolden, I think it was a really great testament to how far uh, organizing in Michigan, how strong advocates have become in the state of Michigan, that there was just like this instantaneous blowback against the stuff that Justice Bernstein said. I think we're getting closer to having some real second chances, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done.
Well, and I think in that, Tony, in that particular situation, the fact that he got that far caused the conversation. And if he hadn't have been able to get that far, there wouldn't have even been a conversation. So he really opened the door for, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? Why are we limiting these people? The number of years that they served, they're out, they're supposed to get started as a second chance new. This person's very well qualified, mostly more qualified than anybody that could take that job. The only reason he wouldn't give them that job is because they had been previously incarcerated. Why do we think that way? Is that the way that we really want it to be? And those are the stories and the conversations that need to be had, because I don't think people really even think about it until you start talking about it.
Absolutely. I think for and this is the disconnect. I think for most people, Brent, I'm sorry. When you think about, most people think you do the crime, you do your time.
Yeah.
Right. That's the really overwhelming sentiment of the public. And
right.
So once we start like peeling back the layers of what it's really like to do the crime, do the time, and then stay in this state where you're perpetually punished,
right.
the general public is like, wait, no, that's not the way it should be.
Right.
And so I think more of the public is getting on board to say, yeah, people should have a real second chance. They did their time. Let's give them an opportunity.
Okay, so let's get into a little bit of that, because Tony, you started doing that and started advocating. I'm not sure when your book came into play here, but I'd like to talk about that, because when did you write this book, and tell me a little bit about the book.
So absolutely, it's again. So I don't. It's a fiction book, and I know most of my colleagues write nonfiction, and I commend them. But like I mentioned early on, I fell in love with reading. And
Midnight Whispers, by the way, Midnight Whispers.
Yep, Midnight Whispers. It's a book about two young men that grew up as best friends. One is named Midnight, and one, that's their nicknames. One is nicknamed Midnight, and one is nicknamed Whispers. And it's really following them two growing up and growing apart, as one matures and one doesn't. And I think it's a great story.
I'm going to check it out. I love reading, so I've got this thing. I'm on my bike now because I found this trainer that you put your bike on, and so I only was going to have it on there for the winter time. But now that I've all set up and I can read on the bike, that's how I read now. But so I'm going to get that. Okay. Midnight Whispers. You get it on Amazon?
Absolutely.
Okay. So let's get back into Tony. So you're having struggle in getting to and from and getting all that. So when does something work for you?
So I actually go. I'm not sure who told me, but I actually go to a temp service. It's a day working service called Labor Ready. And what you do is you show up there and you sign in and you just wait in the hopes that you'll get a job for the day. And so that's what I started doing. I did actually try to do some plasma, but that didn't work out for me. And so I would go every morning to Labor Ready in the hopes of getting a job. Sometime I would get a 1-day job or a 2-day job, but eventually it led up to me, getting assignments that would last a month or a few weeks. And I ended up getting a temporary assignment at a company that offered me another position based on the work I did as a
Based
temp.
on what you had done on your temp service. You didn't give up. And they saw
No,
that no matter what.
I couldn't give up. I couldn't give up, right? I always felt, and I still feel like that I know so many brilliant people that are still incarcerated, right? That I feel like I need to make a statement as to what we're throwing away as a society.
Yes. Yeah. So how did you move into the role you're in now?
So another guy that I used to be in the street with, who went to prison, got out and turned his life around. He became a pastor, and he was doing some nonprofit work. He was actually at that time working as the legislative director for a state rep here in Michigan. So he tells me he wants me to come and meet him. I thought it was about a possible paralegal job. Yep. So I grew up, never been to the Capitol, never been in a lawmaker's office. And here he is, the director over that office, right? My guy I used to be in the street with. And so he's talking to me and he's telling me he wants to grow this organization out, and I would be perfect for a branch in Jackson and kind of getting that off the ground. And so I'm like, okay, sure, I'll help. And that's where it started, right? That's where it started. And I want to say that was probably late 2016, early 2017.
And I mean, just because I know, because of Daryl Woods and Marvin Cotton, you are a guy that's known as a player that's advocating and making change for policy in the world for the previously incarcerated. Can you kind of talk about what you're doing?
Absolutely. So right now in the state, we're laser focused on addressing housing. We've been working on this for probably the last 4 years, growing out a campaign locally around the state in different cities, trying to work to get cities to address the issues that people with criminal histories face in accessing housing. We've had some success in those cities on the local level, and so this year, using that local success, we're planning to mount a statewide campaign to change the laws across the state to stop the discrimination that people face in accessing housing. I think it's absurd, and I think most people will agree.
I love it, Tony, because I don't think people even realize that if you really take it all the way down and break it all the way to the studs, the ex-felon is the last of its breed that you can legally discriminate against. And you imagine if you had a box, if you were black or white or American, you can't do it. You can't do it, but you can. Right. And what you're doing is so important. Housing is one of the most important things you can ever have for an individual who's trying to get anywhere in life. And to be able to put your voice behind that because you've lived it and you're part of it just gives that much more power to be able to affect change. And I love what you're doing. I just think it's what we were talking about before we got on. What I hope out of this, Tony, is that the hard work that you do and the policies that you change, I think the bigger piece of all that is there's so many different pieces of ex-felons doing good things across the country. They need to have some kind of umbrella over them to lock arms and get it all done, be a one big voice, because there's so many good minds out there that are making that step and getting the door open for so many people. But it's people like you, Tony, that you're dedicating yourself to making that change. And you, along the way, what you're doing is inspiring people too. And I was telling you that what I love about this program now is we're in over 200 prisons, and over hundreds of thousands of tablets that are being listened to as we feed these out. And stories like yours, Tony, of doing the 20 years, going through hard work, of not giving up, telling you no, you making connections out there. The guy says you'd be great at this. You take it and you take it with a voice and start making change. That's the secret sauce. That's the stuff that makes things work.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I guess the only thing I would add on to that is that not everybody has that same level of tenacity, right? Of a Brent or a Tony or a Marvin or a Daryl Woods. And so the work is really about giving opportunities for those people that may not be able to handle those no's, who will probably fail if they can't get a job the first, fourth, and fifth time. And so I'm really mindful of that this is about really getting rid of those barriers that cause people to fail, right? And that's really my passion in life. Until we can get all of this done, that's where I'm gonna be.
I love it. And having a good passion is really what, I mean, that's the thing that fuels you. And once you find that passion, it makes everything else make sense.
It does.
Got a question for you, Tony. For everybody that's out there, you have lived through things that no one could really, unless you've experienced it, and doing 20 years in a prison. What do you think is your biggest takeaway from all of it?
In one word, is and I think you know this, being able to adapt, having flexibility. And I think it's funny because it kind of applies in with our body as well. You know, the older we get, the stiffer we tend to get. And so, you know, as you lose flexibility, it just makes life difficult. I would encourage people to be flexible and not get locked into an idea of who they think they are, because they're probably more than that. I've had a lot of friends I've lost since I've been home, who I've encouraged to get into this work, but they were so locked into a sense of who they thought they were that they couldn't see themselves like becoming something other than that. So I would just encourage people to embrace flexibility, embrace the idea. Yep.
And Tony, you being able to adapt, it gives you so much more confidence in you. That's what you've done. You know, you had to adapt every step, but the key to that was you didn't quit stepping. You know, adapting to you meant falling forward and evolving in whatever that was, and you've done that both in prison and since you've been out of prison, figuring out what steps those are, but you were stepping forward with it. And that's a key.
And I appreciate that. I appreciate you saying that, Brett.
But that's a great takeaway, though, because people can live by that. For those looking for a book out there, looking for Midnight Whispers, go to Amazon. I've got a book too. It's called Nightmare
What's your
Success.
book, Brett? What is it? Nightmare?
Yeah, Nightmare Success.
I'm looking it up.
Yeah,
I'm looking it up.
Check it out. Go to Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I think also Walmart has it. So yeah, Tony's got a book, Midnight Whispers. Brent's got a book, Nightmare Success. For all those out there, don't forget to go to Apple. When you're on an Apple platform, there's 3 little bars up there. Follow the show. Makes it easy. While you're on that site, go scroll a little bit down, and you can leave a review. It really helps. Really helps to leave a review because it pumps up the volume on how they promote the show. If you want to leave me a message or anything, I love talking back and forth on BrentCassidy.com. Don't forget that I spell Cassidy wrong. I spell it with a TY instead of a DY. Part of the cool guys are DY, Sean and David, I guess. For those and the likes and the comments on social media, love that. Just keep doing it, and I'll follow back up, and love the back and forth. As I used to say when I was typing my own emails back and forth from Leavenworth, stay strong, and I'll do the same. Tony Gant, thank you for being here today, man.
I appreciate you, Brent, man.